in the room. I'm sorry for those joining online, but we get to continue the conversation. Over hey, how's it going? So that'll be happening right after. Also this afternoon, we're kicking off the Beyond the Web Data Salon series, which is going to be fantastic with the Searles and Angie. So I think that starts at 2, which is going to be a great conversation with our own in-house expert and historian, Doc Searles, are going to be interviewed by Angie, and it's going to be a nice hour. So maybe you can join that too if you're interested in anything about the history of the internet and looking ahead. Right now, though, we're doing our fantastic second week in the Colloquium series with Dr. Sonja Amadae. So, Sonja, thank you so much for coming to us from MIT, where she's a research affiliate, and the University of Helsinki, where she's a lecturer, and she's going to be speaking on polycentric climate governance, applying anti-rival sNFT cryptocurrency tokens. I love it. I absolutely love it. My conversation right before this was with a student who is so interested in blockchain. So I think it's having another moment right after it was merge day with Ethereum last week, right? So if you don't know what merge day was, do a quick search. This was a big environmental impact, Sonja. Maybe we'll turn to that, right? Because supposedly that's going to cut the environmental impact of Ethereum by something like 99.95%, because they're switching from statements of work to like basically proofs of stake. But that has big impacts on governance, because now it's just the big players that get to make the calls in terms of transactions and verification, rather than using up all this computing power to do it. So anyway, a lot of interesting questions there. I hope I didn't steal any thunder there, Sonja.
That was a great segue. Just let me know when you want me to start.
Yeah, well, if you wouldn't mind, the floor is yours. And then just per usual, everybody, feel free. Think about the questions, use the chat, use the raise hand feature. I'll be monitoring and look forward to a great discussion.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really, I feel such an honor and privilege to be here. We are using Ethereum-based tokens, and we are hoping that we can move to the proof of stake versus proof of work. And with respect to the technology driving how we make them possible in their environmental efficiency. But first, I just want to mention that the research that I'll be presenting is on an ERC Horizon 2020 grant that was for 2.75 million euros. And I'm here with my team, the Food Futures Research team, which has our own case study. And so Shreya Sod, and I think that Ruta, I don't know if she's here, I wasn't able to see, but Ruta Jameti as well. So they're my stalwart team. And we've been working on this project together for over a year now. So with that, I'm just going to jump in because it's a lot of material to cover. Here's the overview of the structure of my presentation. So I'm going to first introduce you to what Food Futures is, just briefly. Then, of course, the problem of the tragedy of the commons, the theoretical basis that I'm mobilizing in order to put forward the solution that we've been implementing, what we did, what the outcome was, what the challenges have been, and what our next steps are. So that's where I'm headed. This is from our website directly, and I hope that, well, you feel as enthusiastic as me to have the opportunity to actually mention Elinor Ostrom. So the Food Futures Wellbeing and Suffering Index gathers food production impact variables into one place, supporting transparency of environmental sustainability impact. We apply Nobel laureate economist Elinor Ostrom's polycentric governance using shareable non-fungible blockchain tokens to measure, record, and recognize actors' contributions. The expected outcome is that citizens are empowered to democratically participate in a constructive feedback loop, enabling more sustainable consumption. So we're all familiar with the environmental tragedy of the commons. And so just referring to the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change, their special report number 15 assesses that if we keep going with the same carbon emission rates for the next 10 years, that there's a 66% chance of staying within the 1.5 degree target, and that there's an overall urgency to achieve carbon neutrality by 2050, that agriculture and food production, which is our focus, it's approximately 18% of the greenhouse gas emissions, and that the food production sector, at least technologically, it may be easier to change than other sectors because we're talking about changing dietary habits and not so much technological advances. And then just to remember that the factor that ruminant supply chains contribute 5.7 gigatons of CO2 equivalent gases a year. So it's about 10% of the total of the CO2 equivalent gases. So the research is occurring in Finland. Finland has announced that it wants to be carbon neutral by 2035. And an interesting fact here is that in 2021, the very green country of Finland with 5.5 million people exceeded the net neutrality for land use by 2.1 metric tons. So we're hoping that if we were successful to kind of gauge the kind of impact that could come about is to help Finland maintain its carbon neutrality for land use. We're focusing on reductarianism, which means reduction in CO2 usage per individual and not an outright revolution of behavior. So here's a bunch of facts. If you read through the paper, then these will be familiar, but just again, because we're talking about changing consumptive processes and having some kind of an idea of where we're headed in terms of the impact that we would seek if we wanted to really have an impact. So here we can consider meat and cheese consumption per capita in Finland. And these are two rows of figures. It's from 2017 and from 2021. There's not a lot of disagreement or controversy around these figures. It doesn't really matter where you get the sources that you use. So beef consumption's been around 18 to 19 kilograms per person, relatively stable. Pork has gone down to 29 kilograms per person annually, but then poultry has really gone up to 28 kilograms. Cheese has stayed very constant at 25 kilograms per person. Fish, surprisingly, isn't eaten as much as the other meat products, which living in Finland, which is surrounded by oceans, was a surprise to me. And then here's a fact that will come up again, is that 4 kilograms of the beef per capita is imported, so that there's room for change in habits that wouldn't even affect local production. And the pork numbers I should find, but as similar as there's also imported pork. Then there's the number of CO2 equivalent emissions per kilogram of these meat and dairy products. And depending on the world stats figure, which is much more egregious, 100 kilograms per beef versus the stats that we've been using locally, which would be to reduce it to 19 kilograms of carbon gas per kilogram of the substance beef, cheese, and pork, then you can have an idea of the relative impact of the different protein sources. So then to keep things in some kind of a proportion with the imagination, that with the more egregious figures that were by the world stats for 100 kilograms of carbon per kilogram of beef, if we reduce beef consumption by about 4 kilograms per capita, or it would have to be a lot more, up to 20 kilograms per capita, which is more than people are actually eating for the lower figures, then that would potentially reduce carbon gas emission by the 2.2 metric tons. Which would be about 20 on the low side, or 100 less beef burgers per year per person. And then cheese consumption could either be reduced by 16 kilograms per capita, or it'd have to be about, considerably more for the lower figures. So reducing local dairy production, and also in terms of the agriculture around beef, would be quite disruptive. However, if it was possible to reduce the imports of meat, that could maybe be an interesting way to go. And here's an analysis that was from Finnish scholars in 2013, and they also similarly came to the conclusion that it would be a huge disruption if Finns just stopped eating local beef, pork, meat products, and dairy. So they said, however, and part of that was because people would just keep substituting another, like they might move to dairy from beef, for example. But they said, however, when accounting for very significant decreases in beef and pork imports, it is possible that the reduced red meat demand has a desired negative effect on the global greenhouse gas emissions. So that was external research to what we're doing that concurred with the thinking that we've been applying. So taking a deep breath here and then thinking about what theory we're applying. So we're applying Ostrom's polycentric governance with these opt-in communities that are achieved through the Food Futures app. We use a stag hunt model we consider people's positive externalities, we examine the problem of negligibility, and we apply distributed ledger blockchain technology with our, I guess it's our signature thinking, measure, record, recognize individuals' impacts. And then we're going to be talking about using the tokens for sharing them for donated surplus goods. So to start, we are considering an opt-in virtual community, and we're offering participation with the Food Futures app. Communities can have polycentric governance, meaning that if we're successful, we can be not just in Finland, we could also maybe roll out through Europa, which has that 8-campus system. Then each of these different centers of the app development could be polycentric in the sense it could have its own way of handling the data and issuing the tokens. The communities are scalable within a domain or within a nation, and the Food Futures app then presents this actionable tool that measures individuals' actions, can record them, and then will recognize their contributions to the issuance of tokens. There's 2 kinds of tokens. We give participatory tokens, which could eventually confer governance rights. And then we also give the foodprint token, which we envision and are going to try in the fall with some a sharing functionality. So we're all familiar, probably in the Ostrom workshop anyway, with considering the tragedy of the commons in terms of a stag hunt or assurance game versus a prisoner's dilemma. So in the prisoner's dilemma, people would prefer to have everyone else cooperate while they don't. In the game model that we're using, we're assuming that by and large, most people, at least those attracted to the app, will prefer to cooperate given the assurance others will. And we know that's of course not true for everyone. Some will cooperate even if others don't, and others will not cooperate even if others do. But this is an assumption going into our work. So then we aim to encourage positive externalities, and we view that acts of sustainable food consumption are positive externalities when they are in the zone of being sustainable and achieving that target of the 1.5 degree lifestyle. And so we don't focus on any sanctions, only the measure, record, and recognize individuals' contributions. So we are thinking that the contributions to living sustainably have an anti-rival aspect to them, which means that we are not thinking that if a number of people are not eating beef and they're eating vegetable products, for example, that then it permits other people to eat the beef, but we're thinking of an inclusive community that is positive sum with respect to achieving ecological security. So here is, this is a slide that was actually taken from the actual theory of the grant application. So Ostrom's been with us from the beginning, and we're thinking that creating an atmosphere in which obviously is non-excludable, everyone can put whatever CO2 they wish into the atmosphere right now, but that if we're able to live sustainably, then the benefits of that would be positive sum because it would lead to a hospitable climate and people could flourish in that environment. So that's the thinking about what we're trying to achieve as externalities, that once we have the sustainable consumption patterns, that's a net anti-rival source of value for planetary environmental sustainability. So now we're moving on to the problem of negligibility, and it's a big philosophical problem, the problem of the sorites. So the question would be, if you have something that's made up and comprised of very, very many small aspects, like the number of salt crystals in a heap, then you could take away one salt crystal, but then it would still be a heap. So how many salt crystals can we individually remove and then change the attribute of how we would characterize that to no longer being a heap? So any actions that are similarly negligible can then lack any kind of a motivation for behavioral change. Thus, for large-scale collective action failures, such as runaway carbon gas emissions, perhaps individuals just simply feel powerless to make any difference. So I fail to contribute because I simply don't believe, and I really correctly believe, that my individual actions will not make a difference to planetary sustainability. But I would contribute if I did know others would. So if the externalities are an aspect of this big problem of the tragedy of the commons, how do we solve that particular problem? So this is a fundamental breakdown of instrumental rationality when I don't think I can really contribute to a sustainable planetary future. So here's where the distributed ledger accounting technologies come in. So if you've read through my paper, then I have the tables that would represent first the case where there's no treatment. And the idea here is to capture a stag hunt situation where we're considering people who are making meal choices in a university cafeteria. So on average, that the meal choices, they don't differ that much in taste. They might to a small degree, and there might be a slight benefit to eating something that is meat related. But given that people would contribute to greening the environment, if they thought others would, then on balance, people would contribute with the assurance. But if it turns out that I'm the one person who does contribute while everybody else makes that choice to eat like beef that day or whatever's on offer that's not actually sustainable in the long term as a daily meal choice, then I might feel some kind of regret. So this is trying to capture that all things equal, if I was assured of others' cooperation, then I would benefit from cooperating. But if I'm not, then I might well just decide to make my own choice in my own way. So then we think about, well, what can happen if we could remedy the situation with distributed ledger tokens, these cryptocurrency tokens. And here's the idea. So this was the original algorithm that we used. We're probably going to be modifying it for our second treatment. But the idea of this algorithm was that the green effect in this virtual community would be a function of how many people are eating green, so that the number of green tokens, if 100% of people eat green, then it's a simple multiplier of 2, and everybody would get 2 of the footprint tokens. And then if everyone ate yellow, then there's no multiplier. It would just be 1 token each. But the tokens that you get are actually arbitrary. It's more symbolizing that individuals' contributions matter, and being able to confer and offer these tokens as a sign of recognition. And then later the tokens can have some kind of a deferred value, and then they can be shared. And I'll explain how that would work. So I can come back to this if there's a need for further clarification. This was the actual way of thinking about how the tokens would work if we had 50% eating for the variable of carbon dioxide, 50% ate yellow, 25% ate in the red category, and 25% ate green. And then it's the way that the token was calculated. This was actually a slide that we went over with the students, so it would be transparent how their tokens were issued. Okay, so then we are using a shareable non-fungible token. It is an Ethereum token. And we actually are also giving participation tokens, so that people's history of how many times they're validating their meals, they could still get governance rights, not as a function of the sustainability of their choices, but more that they're opting into the system. And so the idea of conferring the tokens is that it's an indelible blockchain record of people's contributions to eating in a sustainable way. The individual histories are private, but then we're able to aggregate and show collective outcomes for how the community eats as a function of being able to aggregate the data, which is anonymized, and then sharing that with all of the people that are using the app, and also with a vendor who also had access to our data. So each of these tokens actually has the function that potentially it's clickable, so that each individual token, you could open it up and you could identify exactly what happened on the specific day that it was issued, so that you could see what you ate and you could see how other people ate. And it would be capturing a moment in time that's holographic with respect to its relationship to what others ate, and to one's own, what other meals were available, and what one's own choice is. So here's what we did. We made a partner with a vendor, Unicafe, which is a University of Helsinki cafeteria, and they then supplied us with the data for the protein sources for their meals. And then we were able to offer that data through the app to the users of the app. We engaged in software development. How did we get our experimental subjects? We taught a pilot course at the University of Helsinki May through March with 12 students over 8 weeks. We're also ramping up to have a whole MOOC called Sustainable Consumption, which will hopefully ultimately be in Uni Europa. So it's an opportunity for us to have more users of the app. We are ethics board approved. We share all of our anonymized aggregated data with the public. And then we also held a participatory workshop that was for 1 hour a week for all of the students, broken into 2 groups, that we could get a lot of detailed feedback on how their experience was going throughout this course. So here's an introduction to the app. This is what the screen would look like. And for every meal that we cover in terms of the data, we actually are thinking of ourselves as more than a carbon calculator, because we're using other variables as well. So eventually we hope that our signature food well-being and suffering index would not just have carbon footprint, but it will have material footprint and water footprint. And thanks to Rita's thesis, her master's thesis, we are going to be able to do water, material, and carbon footprints. We will know the protein sources because that's basic nutritional information, but we hope to also have land use, animal welfare, packaging waste, and yeah, so that we're hoping to add other categories to our index. So this is the visual graphic that is on the app, and we want green, yellow, and the pink to be interpreted as eat often, eat sometimes, and eat rarely. So we're not shaming people into thinking that some food choices are bad, but just that they should be eaten less often. So here is what the students would see when they were comparing their cafeteria meals on a given day, so that we get the data about the menu and the specific protein sources. And then you could see here that the chicken korma versus the seitan vegetable is green for the 3 variables we're able to support right now, while it's yellow for the chicken korma. And so the students then are able to validate which purchase they make, and then the validation process gives them a participation token just by the validation, and then it gives a foodprint token depending on whether their meal choice was green or yellow. Also, in the first round, how the data aggregated, but we're going to be probably modifying that for the second round. Here is how we had our breakdowns, and with carbon dioxide, I believe it was less than 4 or 5 kilograms of CO2. Then that's the break between the red and the yellow. And then I think it was around 10 kilograms of carbon per kilogram of product turned the, no, that was between the red and the yellow. And for the lower, it was between the yellow and the green. But this is speculative in the sense that this was right when we began. And this is just giving us an idea of how we wanted to have clear breaking points that we would share with users in terms of when a meal went from the pink to the yellow to the green. Here are more screens from the Food Futures app, so that we have the index, the food suffering well-being index. We have the lifestyle that shows how students or the users, where they are on the scale toward the 1.5 degree lifestyle. On the right, they have their token balance. And on in the third column, they can see the aggregate community of Food Futures users versus on the right, the data we had from all of the users at the venue, so that we can show allocative efficiency with our diners in the left 2 rows of this. Then this is another way of visualizing collective impact, because we think it's really important to show that together communities can really make a difference. Now I'm just moving on toward the end of my talk, because I know I need to finish for the Q&A. Our outcomes are that we issued the foodprint token according to the payoff matrix, we achieved proof of concept, we used participatory design, we did demonstrate quantitative allocative efficiency, which the ERC is really keen on us demonstrating, and then we received an interest in more venues and in having some sharing functionality. The challenges we're facing is we need a business model who's going to sponsor this. We need to cover the blockchain costs. It's 30 cents per transaction right now, which is fine if we update the balance sheets once a week. We've been doing it daily. Scalability, how can we get more venues, more industries? How can we have inclusive access for anyone, say in an open university? We need to guarantee token security, and we need to look toward interregional polycentric governance, how to have a good standard maintained across different regions. Here's our next steps: more venues in Helsinki, venues in other Finnish cities. We want to establish the food well-being and suffering index, maybe even in the retail consumer grocery trade in Finland. We want to have the trial food print token for self-validation for the Open University. We want the pedagogic support with an Open University MOOC. We want enhanced app with a sharing functionality, and I can explain that in Q&A. And then we're going to be running our second pilot, should be beginning of November. And then we're just summarizing. So what does Food Futures do? We provide data on sustainability values of food choices. We empower informed dining choices. We share user sustainability concerns with vendors who can act on this information. We enable users to view individual and collective impact of meal choices. We counter climate anxiety that individuals cannot impact global outcomes. And we provide a tool for opt-in polycentric governance at the micro level of cryptocurrency token acknowledgements. And then here's some of what we're wondering about. How can we apply the social ecological systems framework more effectively? Are we missing some vitally crucial literature because we want to submit to the Journal of Institutional Economics? How can we become more deeply integrated into the Austrian polycentric governance community? We want to figure out how to evaluate how well our Food Futures virtual community is operating with respect to a business model and virtual governance. And then maybe there's some other case studies we should know about. So with that, I think I'll just go ahead and stop sharing my screen and turn it over to the Q&A.
Well, first off, Sonja, thank you so much. What a rich presentation. Oh my God. I think we're going to need to block out the rest of the afternoon here. This was just amazing. So yeah, guys, the queue is open. As always, we'll turn to any students first who might have a question to kick us off. Anything that might have come to mind, including what the heck is a blockchain, which is fine. And then the queue will be open from there. Yeah, do you want to kick us off? Yeah, please feel free. It'd be great.
Thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm curious what you see as the advantage to this model over just not serving beef in the cafeteria.
Could you hear that okay, Sonja?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, that's already happening. The UniCafe does not serve beef. In fact, they don't, I think there's actually no strictly red choice, although it is surprising if you dig deep into the footprints of some of the foods, like shrimp, for example, is red with respect to how it impacts the oceans. So we are consciousness aware raising, and we think that overall we need to establish sort of a beachhead or the thin end of the wedge, because these students are obviously part of that community that are eating the 19 kilograms of beef per capita on average. And so that if people are subjected to this, and if they're even rating that they're making this one meal choice, that it is green or yellow, then that's already having some kind of an impact. Furthermore, we did show that with the Food Futures app, that if I could go back to the screen that showed that there were some of the red choices. In fact, I think on that day it had to do, well, cheese is actually toward the red zone, and the shrimp choice was toward the red zone, because I questioned both Ruta and Shreya at length about how UniCafe could be serving red meals, so that our diners are eating more toward the green than even toward the yellow. And so that is allocative efficiency. And then also in partnering with UniCafe, they want everyone to be eating green, but they have told us they don't want to make that dictatorial choice. When they took beef off the menu, there was a huge identity politics outcry from the students and the communities of people that are wedded to the agriculture in Finland that's tied to the land. And so UniCafe wants this to be a migration of consumer choice, and they don't want to be forcing students to eat green because they think it's a good moral choice. So they are really happy to partner with us because they think that we're presenting a tool for them to have a natural migration of consumptive preference, rather than UniCafe just saying, okay, we're just having vegan meals from now on. So I hope that answers your question. I think this would be actually a much longer conversation, and it's just to open up to more questions that I'm not going into more, but that's at least the surface of the answer to your really good question. Thank you.
No, thanks a lot. Yeah, Gustavo, please, and then let me know.
Okay, hi. So a couple of questions. So I was thinking about exactly what is the mechanism that helps with the collective action problem here. Okay, so it's either information, it's that because others see what you are doing, it's like the pin after you cast your ballot is I vote. So it's this type of mechanism that is helping with the collective action problem. So it's for me, it was a little difficult to really understand what is the mechanism. Second, I think that there is a lot of literature on collective action problems. If you approach things like Schelling, Thomas Schelling approach, like a tipping game, I would highly recommend the book by Fernando Medina, A Unified Theory of Collective Action and Social Change, published by the University of Michigan Press. It's a very good summary of collective action problems. I also had a paper on experimental stuff related to collective action problems. I can send you an email with that stuff. But specifically to this experiment, I was thinking that you may have a lot of problems with substitutions, no? I can eat green in the university, so I get the tokens, and then I go back home in the evening, and I have a big burger, and overall, there is zero net effects on society. So essentially, with these global things, that's part of the problem. If you only take one piece of the issue, you may be losing these kind of huge substitution effects, no?
Yeah. So I'm going to work from the back of that. That is such an excellent point. And of course, it's what we're all worried about at the back of our minds. I mean, to some extent, of course, that the cafeteria itself is trying to have a carbon neutral footprint. So we're helping them do that, even if people go later and eat beef. And then we can ask, do they have a good goal? Is the cafeteria's goal itself pushing people to then make those substitutions? And I think this is where we need to engage in a lot of research, because we need to try to find out as much as possible. Of course, people might not be honest if we poll them and say, you know, what were your dietary choices for the rest of the week? We may run into people may not be so forthcoming, and we might not actually get to know what the truth of their consumption habits is. But I think that that is subject to research, and it's an excellent question, one that, and maybe the most important one that we need to solve, actually. Then with respect to the mechanism, thank you for raising that, because you did put several on the table. I mean, you put in terms of that we would have maybe visibility. There's information, first of all. We do think, and we've gotten feedback that just having the information from the app leads people to make that informed choice. So there's definitely that factor. Then we have the mechanism of, yes, you could see if one of our own users ate red, for example, that would show up on the aggregated data. And so, yes, you have that publicity of one's own action, even though it's anonymized, and it wouldn't be personalized to the individual. But then it could also be, so that's like, how do I look, even if I'm anonymous, to the group? And then it could be maybe this tipping point that at some point, if everyone is moving toward making the green choice. So I think that when you are bringing in mechanisms, maybe that's the central question that we should be putting on our research agenda and trying to figure out how can we govern the next step in our pilot so we can answer that question. So that's a very valuable question. I'm grateful. Thank you.
Can I just a brief follow-up?
Yeah.
So if you are doing, if you can experiment with the app, so maybe if you have individual, so let's say for a week, you only give information to just a specific number of people versus the whole group. So maybe when you are considering just individual people, it's just an information channels that you have there, no? So as everybody is getting the same message, you may have something else, no? So to some extent you can, individually, I may be reacting to, I didn't know that this had a big carbon print, and now I know, and that's why I'm changing my behavior. Or, but you can figure out that. So if you only provide information to me and that's it, and then I don't know what's going on with the rest, that's a pure information mechanism, no? But if I know that I can compare with the rest, or I get information about others, then that will give you not only information, but something else, no? So maybe at the very least, at the margin, you can play around with these different mechanisms. No?
Yeah, I wonder what kind of numbers we'd have. Like, would 100 be enough, or would we have to cross into the thousands in order to have the treatment groups where some are getting the aggregated data versus some are just getting pure information about here is how your consumption. I think it's excellent, and I'll have to think about when we have sufficient numbers to have that kind of a treatment. So thank you. That's really a good idea.
Really good points, Gustavo. Looks like Wesley's up next. I'm monitoring the room here as well. And then obviously Brian and Jess, but let me know. We can interject with other folks here too. So Wesley, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll ask just one. Actually, before I ask a question, could I ask a very quick clarifying question on cost? So you mentioned it was like a 30-cent cost per transaction. Is that per meal, per person, per day, or is it like a batch that it applies to?
Yeah, it's per token, but I mean, per issuing of token per wallet, because the students had a digital wallet, and it was fun actually teaching people about cryptocurrency and then having a digital wallet. I really enjoy that because I'm a political economist. We have blockchain skeptics on my team who are horrified, like, why do we need blockchain? But leaving that aside, the 30 cents, we do know in talking to the app developer, who's really, he's very shrewd. We're thinking about if we just update the food print token balances and the participatory balances once a week, then it would be 30 cents per user per week. And that already cuts down the transaction costs significantly. But this is something, if we move to holochain instead of blockchain, we could even get the transaction costs down to where they're negligible, but that's another story. And we'd probably need greater proof of concept before we started to do that.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So my main question is I wanted to ask about privacy. So I understand like the privacy as you laid out in terms of anonymizing individual token purchases. Obviously on the app, they're not anonymized for that person, right? Because the person needs to see their own balance, and that data I assume exists on your end.
Can you stop for a moment there, though?
Yeah.
We had to promise, so in going to GDPR data privacy approval for the ethics review board, what we did is we told everybody how to have a digital wallet that was anonymized, so that, yes, if you had the key and if you knew how to link a random email address that's not linked to personal legal identity, if you knew the key, then you would be able to decode everything. But if students sign up, and we told them they should definitely use an email address that wasn't connected to their legal person, because if they were using their legal person, it was pretty close to then figuring out their dietary habits. So just to put that there before you go further.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I guess that maybe addresses some of my question. I just think it's like an interesting balance, because one of the selling points for NFTs is that they aren't anonymized, right? Like it's part of the accountability mechanism NFTs, that like the record is clear on the chain or whatever, and like there's more sense of personal ownership. And so I obviously support anonymity, but it's like interesting interplay there, where like the more anonymized it is, the more it seems like the blockchain itself is kind of less serving its function. And it kind of seems to be similar then to like, well, what if the NGO is just managing its portfolio of something that isn't exactly an NFT, but serves the same purpose? Because you don't need to have that necessarily on the blockchain from an anonymity perspective. Sorry if my question got lost in there.
Okay, so yeah, so the idea is, what if a nonprofit, sort of the idea of loyalty points versus blockchain, and to at least my thinking, and I know there's some variation on our team, so speaking for myself, the way of thinking about it is that, well, in the economic analysis I put forward in the paper, if someone eats green for a whole year for all of their meals, then it would be potentially a like 130 euros, maybe, that they would qualify for some kind of an actual monetary reward. And the thinking was that if it's blockchain, then say 5 years from now or 10 years, if Finland if they achieve that carbon neutrality and they want to acknowledge people's contributions, then they could use the blockchain as a reliable source, where loyalty points from a grocery store is a little bit iffy in terms of, okay, now we're going to give tax credits for like 0.5% of a rebate on your tax bill, annually or something. So from my thinking, that sustainability is an issue as important as currency, that the reason for the currency would be that we're making life death decisions individually aggregated for the future of our planet, then the privacy, I guess, I mean, that's the thing that, well, wouldn't you know a lot about that person if they've accumulated so many of these footprint tokens? And so, well, so far people haven't minded that people would know that they are roughly eating toward vegan, but yeah, maybe that's something we need to think about more carefully. We thought that the bigger issue is that if we could identify people who are eating according to a certain ethnic group, and that you could target people for showing that they're a member of an ethnic group that then could be discriminated against. And as far as we know, we're not able to do that. But yeah, we're focusing, that's one of our questions ongoing. So very important issue.
Again, for the students, I put up just a link to General Data Protection Regulation in the EU. If you're not familiar, it's much more omnibus than what we have here in the States.
Yeah.
Would you like to interject before we?
Question on the context is how the token is changing the value over time. I think
Mm.
in the
Yeah.
beginning, for example, I don't know, it costs $100, but over time, I think when I buy coffee, green coffee, I have some contribution of the token, but at the end, how much who provide the value of the token at the end?
Yeah.
Good question. Is it floating against a basket of other
Yeah.
currencies, Sonja?
No. So
okay.
this this is a great question. Thank you for asking this. So this is a shareable non-fungible token and it's anti-rival. So first of all, we can just mint them at will. And we're not worried about inflation. We're not worried about inflation because it's not a rival currency. The idea that the more of this token that's issued, the more value in terms of having more contributions to the positive externalities of getting toward the 1.5 degree planetary target, that the more that we're achieving that. So it's not supposed to be a currency that's in circulation that you exchange. So shareable means that you don't delete one copy when you give it to somebody else. So the thinking is, and we're going to pioneer this in the fall, that UniCafe has a plan where they already right now for €3, the meal costs students, I think it's $2.60 as subsidized. So the students pay $2.60, the Finnish government picks up the rest of the tab. I think it's a roughly €5 meal that's half subsidized roughly by the government. And then at the end of the day, there's leftover food and UniCafe then sells that, or they give it away for €3 for a box and you get much more of the protein source. So it's kind of a better value than the actual meal. Well, we are going to pilot that there'll be some kind of a sharing rate where if you have so many of the food print tokens, you share them with UniCafe. UniCafe then gives you the €3 value. And Atarka, the grant, we're going to be the money end of that. So we're thinking ultimately it should be surplus goods that are donated by someone that are shared so that the user always maintains their account of how many of these positive externality contributions they've made. Their total sum of the token, the food print token, never goes down, but some of those end up being shared. And then the person or the party that's doing the donation will also have a balance. So let's say I'm a huge sponsor and I'm going to be donating this resource for allocation. The idea would be like film tickets that are going to waste anyway, and maybe a movie theater would say, okay, here's 100 tickets a week. They're not being used. It's Monday night. We know those seats are empty. And then a certain number of the food print tokens would be shared. The donor would always have the balance so they can say, we sponsored this many units of the food print token, and the user would always have their balance of the total number of food print tokens. Eventually, and I've already talked to our software developer, that I'd like to have it where the sharing would be according to first come, first served, or a lottery, or an actual auction, and that would be by participatory governance rights. But we have to go really slowly, one step at a time. So at the beginning, it's just going to be some kind of one token for one box of leftover food, and we'll do the sharing, and we'll see how that all works out, hopefully in November and December. But that's an excellent question. I'm sorry, it sounded like I talked forever on that question.
This is all great. Yeah, Brian, please.
Okay, good. This is really neat to hear. And that's speaking of somebody who actually read your previous book on Prisoners of Reason and liked it. And First, just a semantic comment. I will suggest talking about anti-rival is neat in the context of the workshop and having this matrix to talk about whole different categories of goods. But for the broader public and so on, some different terms, whether you talk about synergy, whether you talk about green tokens, I don't know, but whether you have anybody who thinks kind of marketing approach on your team might be interesting to go into. Second, a kind of technical comment that I really like and agree with the idea of, okay, this may be better framed as a stag hunt problem rather than the prisoner's dilemma. However, the further extension of that logic is to say that ultimately you would actually like to have a situation where people would feel good about making the green decision, even if other people don't. So it's not even an assurance problem, that from whatever set of motives, they actually feel it's a better decision for them to do the related game where you've switched the bottom two payoff ranks. Concord in the work I've done, but it's also called comedy, no conflict. It's also called fight, but I won't go into that. And this raises the broader question, some of which was coming up earlier, of how to understand the range of motives people have, including the one that I think doesn't show up in the paper, the question of motivational crowding. Okay, it could be interesting to share surplus goods or so on, but does that somehow shift the mindset of how people are making these decisions, that they expect to have some more material kind of reward, which is potentially, like the motivational crowding literature, potentially counterproductive, or an interesting question again to understand how people are making these decisions. So thank you and good stuff.
So I guess I'm interested. So you don't mind that anti-rival, the theory is okay, just not the vocabulary, just to clarify what you're saying?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I didn't know if you think that anti-rival passed muster theoretically. I think it works, but so
theoretically it's fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
positive
Okay.
externalities and
Yeah. Okay, so then with respect to the motivational crowding, I think that we are all really very sensitive to that. And that's why originally we had measure, record, reward, but we didn't like measure, record, reward because it sounds like, well, you're getting a brownie point. So measure, record, recognize is supposed to just solve the assurance problem. And yeah, I guess it is interesting to think, do the tokens ever need to do more than just have that acknowledgement of recognition? Do they ever actually need to be shared? And I think that's what we're taking into our pilot. See Shreya, at least on my right on the visuals, and we are pretty interested in exactly this kind of a question, because we certainly don't want to go to the motivational crowding. I mean, that would be a terrifying outcome. Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, I found your talk and your paper really, really interesting. And just, I think as many people have noted, just a lot to think about and a lot to unpack. I want to go back to Gustavo's question about mechanisms, because there's an additional one that sort of gets, and I should say I'm probably the least experience and exposure to blockchain stuff in the room, virtual or otherwise. So my one question I have is, why, to what extent is in fact the blockchain stuff necessary, given that we have quite a bit of literature about the importance of, like in non-cooperative game theory early on, it was like cooperation doesn't matter, but actually now we sort of know that that communication doesn't matter, but now we actually know that communication does actually matter, is not always cheap talk. And so I'm curious about like the extent to which an alternative mechanism would be if you actually knew the other people well that were part of your community of eaters or whatever, right? How is that? So there's the straight up information mechanism that Gustavo mentioned, but then there's the, like, let's say you have a community of people, right, that and that are similar to you in some way, and that are more than just another person with this app, right? Would you expect that to be a more effective or effective at all strategy for changing individual decisions in terms of how they choose what they're going to eat, right? And would that matter, right? How much of this sort of what, and again, this is sort of the informational, there's the sort of like sort of how we think, is there some sort of threshold question, which I think was a second mechanism that Gustavo was getting at, which incidentally, as a side note, I think folks have started looking at this with the vaccination uptake in the US in smaller communities, but we can talk about that some other point. And then the third would be sort of, if you know the people around you are making these decisions, that's a stricter requirement, but I'd be curious, right? How many of these people, and this is your privacy problem, know each other that are participating in this app and are sort of doing it together, right? With the idea that, oh, the people that I eat with every day are doing this. I apologize if I've missed something major in my question and that you sort of answered thoroughly in your paper and I didn't see it. But I'd be curious, it sounds like there's a third mechanism here that I'd sort of would want to add, which is sort of actually knowing that there are other people like you and that that are also deciding this. And so it's not just the recognition, it's not just threshold or information.
Yeah, so not just recognition, not just threshold of information, but knowing other people. So I think it's partially probably just the local cafeteria environment in Finland, which is so unique globally, that so there's no commercial dining on campus at the University of Helsinki, and it's got 17,000 students. And so the university cafeterias, they're serving a lot of lunches every day. And those 17,000 people don't know each other. Now, of course, it's a long way to think that everyone's going to be using our app, but it isn't a stretch to think that maybe we could move past the hundreds to 1,000. And it's definitely the case that if we're in the Open University and we're recruiting students and we have this meshed with a pedagogic explanation of the impacts of eating, we're wedded to the idea of consumer sovereignty. That's sort of like our beginning place. We want consumers to be empowered, and we know there's a lot of, we don't want the government to step in and just tell people what to eat. So we think that in terms of how we're envisioning rolling out the app, these people are not going to know each other. It's only in happenstance if they happen to see each other using the app in the cafeteria that they're going to think, oh, maybe there's somebody like me. So it really is a virtual community that's self-created around. I mean, we're assuming, yes, there could be some hackers that are going to try to ruin the app by always getting the participatory token and maybe always eating as red as possible. And that's probably a hacking risk that we'll have to address if someone's really out to ruin us, if we get that, if we hit the news to that extent. But no, this is a lot of lunches in a pretty big dining venue that's very anonymous.
Thanks a lot, Sonja. And thanks as well, Jess. Did you have a follow-up, or was the hand still up from? Oh, yeah. I've done the same thing. No worries. I just had a few, but yes, please, let's turn to you first and then and you as well, Joyce. Great. Yeah. You can go ahead. Oh, ladies first, Joyce.
Thanks. So I have a couple of thoughts about various things that were mentioned. One of them is this, the last thing you just talked about, that you think this is really somebody's going to be doing it privately because there's 17,000 kids. I mean, my kid just graduated from college. He ate with the same people every single day. So my sense is that you should take advantage of people who are into doing it, and particularly with the token involved, like you're going to tell your friend. So that's just a thought about that. The other thing is on this informational channel, is there a version of the app that is just out there for people who feel like they want to do this and have not starting with the university with the Uni Cafe with their menu, but if there's a simple thing of the meals you eat during the day that people can just fill in their own, pick from these categories and get a sense of it, you'll have immediately a broader, forget the tokens, forget the whatever. I mean, all that's really great and really interesting, but I think you stop yourself from getting bigger adoption and quicker adoption unless you have like a simple version of it that people can use for when they're having lunch, but they can also use it in the rest of their life.
Yeah, that's exactly what we want to do. And we think that's the vital next step. So what we want is a self-validation. I was calling it a shadow food print token, but one of my two researchers said, no, it should be like a trial footprint token, and that the idea is that people can self-validate. And we probably have the human resources, at least at the beginning, that people can take pictures of their meal and maybe a label of their food, and they can self-validate and they can get like a trial version of it. And we think that's really important for widespread accessibility. So yes, we're thinking the same direction, same idea. We just hope we can implement it, that we have the infrastructure that will be able to pull that off.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe IU can be the second locus. We could talk about it, Sonja. Yes,
Oh,
please.
that'd be so cool. Yes, that
It would be
really
very cool. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be really amazing. Then I could come and visit. I'd really have a reason.
Oh, yeah. We'd love to have you.
Yeah, okay, come. I
Have
could
some
come maybe in.
healthy food, bro. So
Yeah.
some healthy option.
Pizza anymore
Oh,
with you,
man.
Sonja.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, please. Yeah.
I'm concerned about, so we're looking at a carrot and stick methodology, and there's not much incentives to collaborate with your peers because of GDPR regulations. You can't see what other people are eating. There's 17,000 people there, so there isn't much incentive for you to follow the crowd. And if there isn't going to be any carrots, you got to look at sticks. In a polycentric governance, you got to look at a prescriptive force, but there is none of that either. So with no carrots and no sticks and no actual value in the token, because it's not pegged to a currency, not pegged to a basket of goods. What I'm hearing is pegged to the leftover food from the cafeteria. Oh, where is this? Are we just basing this off of just people? I think I wanted to say is food is a very complex thing. It's not something that we eat, and I say it's ingrained in our culture, it's ingrained in your socioeconomic status, ingrained in so much stuff. But it seems that your model doesn't structure any incentives or structure any punishment to overcome those individual values as well as collective values.
Can you clarify what you mean by cognitive? You mean cultural, or you mean what cognitive value?
Collective.
I think it was collective values. Yeah.
Oh, collective values. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I love that skepticism. So, well, we really don't want to have sticks. That's just not, I don't know. We'll see how far we can go without any sticks. And it's interesting because on the one hand, there's this, the motivational crowding, where if we make the token too valuable, then it could be that people just want the tokens, and that when the token becomes the rationale by itself, then you've kind of lost the whole purpose of the token, because it's not supposed to serve the purpose of having all the value. It's supposed to be recognizing people for what they might contribute anyway. Is that going to be sufficient? I think that's a really good question. We have thought that we could have ways for people to opt into communities, like they could become visible make a sub-virtual community on the platform. We don't have that functionality now, but we do think that, I don't know if gamification is the right word, but if there's some aspect of having people able to use the app in conjunction with smaller groups, that's something that we've talked about at some length, but we haven't pioneered that feature. So I think your questions are very good, and they're going to be subject to experimental testing.
Really, really helpful, Sonja. And just in the few minutes that we have left, I just had a few quick thoughts and maybe some ideas that we can follow up on together. But first, for the students, there was an Economist podcast last week from Babbage, which was all about Ethereum and the Ethereum merge and this whole move to proof of stake instead of proof to work and its environmental impact. So if you're interested, that might be a fun thing to listen to. I also just finished this great climate science fiction book, Cli-Fi, called Ministry of the Future. And the whole back of that is this idea of carbon coins, right? So this is like a ton of CO2 not emitted and how that gets monetized over time, which I mean, so I think you're heading a similar direction you're saying. So if you're interested, it's by Kim Stanley Robinson, really, really good book looking ahead over the next 60 years or so. And then you answered several of these, so I'll just mention a few things. Sonja, one is I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we can engender ideas behind polycentricity into the governance model here, given that it is built on the back of Ethereum. And if you had any reservations based on this proof of stake, which has really positive environmental impacts, but from a governance perspective, there's going to be fewer and fewer folks making the calls on how Ethereum blockchain is actually governed. And then also just two quick notes on there is a nonprofit blockchain startup that's trying to get these different communities speaking together around a common framework or basically a common language. There's this guy, Scott Bassett, who just retired from Deloitte leading it up. So I'd be happy to get you in touch if you're interested in kind of getting to know more folks, in that community. And lastly, there was this company Ledger that reached out who wanted to do something with the Ostrom workshop. And we haven't figured out what the what is, but I'm just thinking out loud here. But based on this work, this could be a pretty cool thing that they could get behind and help to sponsor. So if you want a introduction, the guy's name is Ian Rogers, and he's an IU alum actually. So let me know, and I can't promise anything, but I can at least put you guys in touch and take it from there.
Yeah, and I wonder if I could collaborate more with the Ostrom workshop in the sense that then there's greater rigor, greater theory testing, greater experimental testing, like just even getting all these questions has been amazing. And that would lend more credibility to putting in a proposal or something to Ledger, for example.
For sure. I think that's a great idea. And lastly, we do have this blockchain governance initiative at the workshop. It's been kind of a hiatus during the pandemic, but we've gotten a lot of interest in that over the last month. So we're planning a new roundtable to kickstart the blockchain governance work again. It could be maybe right after Thanksgiving break, or worst case, right off the bat in the spring, given how packed this fall is becoming already. But that's coming, and that'll be a nice opportunity to put our heads together as well. And Joyce.
I just had one last thought that I wanted to mention before, but Planet Money did a whole series on food banks and surplus and how it's become the tail wagging the dog, that actually the suppliers of the surplus food, that is part of their calculation and their profit. And I think that might be an interesting thing for you to, it's a podcast series, but they really go into the economics of how it's changed from surplus to being part of the whole profit cycle.
Brilliant, Joyce.
Yeah, okay, so that might be different nation by nation, but that would be really important to look at. And the blockchain governance and how that's going to change from proof of stake, I think that's going to be really interesting to follow. The ERC also wanted us to think through fractional ownership, but I was thinking more be fractional responsibility, inclusive use, and kind of changing this fractional ownership paradigm so it fits a little bit better with what we're doing. But yeah, obviously there's a lot of possibility in this field, and it's just a matter of trying to figure out something that would actually work versus, just doing speculative fun stuff. It's something that could actually work.
There's a space for that too.
Yeah.
Well, one last round of applause for Dr. Amadae. Fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Sonja. Thank you.
Well, I look forward to being in touch, and so I'll see who should I follow up with, and I guess I should follow up with Scott then. Who's